Hello guys, and sorry it's taken so long, but here are your nitrogen cycle notes. So let's talk about the movement of atoms that contain nitrogen, and molecules as well, between sources and sinks of it. So first we need to know what molecules contain nitrogen. So as we're going through a biogeochemical cycle, let's look at how things pass through the living part. So there's biological, aka organic molecules, such as proteins and nucleic acids. When you see that image, that's what I'm referring to, and it's going to stand in just in general for any organic molecules. Ammonium, which is got the chemical symbol of NH4, it's also an ion, so it's got a positive charge. If you've had chemistry already, it's a polyatomic ion, so it tends to travel as a unit. There is also ammonia, which is not an ion. It is not charged, and it's got a formula of NH3. There's atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2. Nitrite, which is NO2, and it's also an ion, so it's a negatively charged one. And then nitrate, which is NO3, also a negatively charged ion. Now, in previous years on the test, you really had to know the difference between nitrite and nitrate, ammonium, and ammonia. In the modern test, it's not as big a deal. For example, you probably won't have to identify whether nitrite is NO2 or NO3. However, it is good to be at least familiar with these chemical formulas, so if you see them in a question, you can recognize what they're talking about. So let's talk about the reservoirs for nitrogen. So if we look at the nitrogen cycle, compared to carbon, all of the reservoirs in the nitrogen cycle tend to be very short-term storage, meaning nitrogen doesn't stay in them for very long periods of time, not like hundreds of millions of years like fossil fuels, for example, which store carbon for a very long time. So you have the biosphere, which is all of the biological molecules and all living things that are containing nitrogen. It's the proteins, nucleic acids. The source for this reservoir is either ammonia or nitrate that's used during a process called assimilation that we'll talk about in more detail. And nitrogen leaves the biosphere through one of two processes, either ammonification or denitrification, which we'll talk about also. The biggest reservoir is going to be nitrogen in the air, N2, and the source of that is denitrification, and it exits via nitrogen fixation. Then the hydrosphere is mostly going to be either nitrate with a little bit of nitrite or ammonia dissolved in water. And this is going to enter water pretty much through runoff from land, which is going to carry dissolved nitrogen-containing compounds. And it's going to exit mostly through assimilation, which is producers in a aquatic environment taking in that nitrogen. You might also have some that's going to exit through sedimentation, but honestly, the rock cycle is not a large enough part of the nitrogen cycle to even be worth mentioning at this point. By far, most of the nitrogen that you'll find in the environment is going to be in the atmosphere. 78% of the air you're breathing in right now is made of nitrogen. However, that nitrogen is in the form of N2, which is two nitrogen atoms that are bound to each other, and they have a triple bond. That means they are sharing 3 pairs of electrons, and it takes a lot of energy to break them down. Because of this, there are only certain organisms that are able to break this triple bond and convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form that organisms can use. And we'll talk about who does that in a little bit. So the processes in the nitrogen cycle are different, varied, and so we're going to look at them one by one because there's a lot of them, and they're probably less familiar to you than, say, the processes in the carbon cycle. So there is nitrogen fixation. This is taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and then turning it into a form that can be used by other living things. This is going to take atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2, and it's usually going to convert it into NH3 or ammonia. There are 2 major ways that's done. That is nitrogen fixation is performed by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Most of them tend to live in close symbiotic relationship with legumes, which are kind of beans, peas, and species like that. They grow these structures called nodules, which are these little enlarged regions that provide a home for bacteria. They can also provide them with some food, and in return, these bacteria fix nitrogen and provide plants with the nitrogen they need in order to build proteins and nucleic acids. There is also a small amount of nitrogen that's fixed by lightning, but there is not nearly enough of that fixed by lightning in order to support living things. So most nitrogen fixation is going to be caused by bacteria. And an important thing to note, this is where we go from inorganic nitrogen, the kind that can't be used by living things, to organic nitrogen, a form that can be used by living things. Next process is nitrification. So you have ammonia that was produced by nitrogen fixation. More plants are able to take up nitrogen in the form of nitrites and nitrates, especially nitrates, than ammonia. So there are some bacteria called nitrifying bacteria that will take in ammonia and they'll produce first nitrite, and then some more of them are able to produce nitrate. And nitrate is the preferred form for plants to take this up. This nitrate is the easiest for the plants to assimilate, which is the next process we're going to talk about. And all of the nitrogen in this step is organic. So it's capable of being used by living things. Notice we now have two processes that are performed exclusively by bacteria. Bacteria play a huge role in the nitrogen cycle, which is kind of what explains the meme that was on the first slide, if you want to go back and look at it at some point. So assimilation is the process of plants taking up usually nitrate, sometimes ammonia from the soil, and converting it into organic molecules. So they take it in, and they're going to make some organic molecules out of it. And this is still organic forms of nitrogen. Next, we have the process of ammonification. This is going to be performed by decomposers, which is going to be either bacteria or fungi. Notice bacteria are playing an important role again, and they're going to take organic molecules like proteins and nucleic acids, and they are going to convert that to ammonia, or ammonium, the ion. And then that can then be converted into other forms by, for example, nitrifying bacteria, and made into forms that are easier for plants to take up. So this is going to be decomposition of either an entire organism when it dies or its waste. So for example, here we have some leaves, but it can also be, for example, poop or anything else that's shed off of a living thing. And this is still staying in organic forms of nitrogen. And then if it's a cycle, we've got to return things to the original source, and that's done by the process of denitrification. So that's when you take nitrate and you convert it into atmospheric nitrogen. Again, it is performed by bacteria. So again, bacteria are playing a huge role, and these specific bacteria are denitrifying bacteria. So each step in the nitrogen cycle that involves bacteria involves different classes of bacteria, different species of bacteria. It's not just this one bacterium that's out there doing it all. And then this is returning organic nitrogen into the inorganic reservoir that is the atmosphere. If this didn't happen, all the nitrogen on the planet would eventually be, taken up into living things or be in the soil, and it would reduce the volume of the atmosphere, which wouldn't be good. So here's the nitrogen cycle as a whole. So let's look at some specific parts. Notice lightning and nitrogen-fixing bacteria are going to take atmospheric nitrogen, or N2, and turn it into a form that can be used by organisms. And so then you've got nitrogen-fixing bacteria, some of which do live in the soil. They're not all living in a symbiotic relationship with plants. They are mostly going to produce ammonium or ammonia, which nitrifying bacteria are going to nitrify. They're going to perform nitrification to make nitrites. Some other nitrifying bacteria are going to then convert that into nitrates. Nitrates are easiest for plants to assimilate or take up. And then here we've got the arrows from living things to decomposers, which are also living, which is going to be fungi as well as bacteria, and they are going to take the organic molecules, break them down, and produce some ammonia. And then finally, you have denitrifying bacteria who are going to perform denitrification, and they are going to return nitrogen to the atmosphere. So humans have an impact on the nitrogen cycle just like we do on the carbon cycle. The biggest way we do that is by adding fertilizer. When you fertilize your lawn, when farmers fertilize the soil to create crops or to grow crops, a lot of that ends up not staying in the dirt. It gets washed away, and that is going to end up as runoff, which is going to end up in waterways. And then you also have livestock operations where you're growing large amounts or raising large amounts of animals for food. This could be cows, this could be pigs, this could be chickens, and those things produce a lot of poop, which we're going to talk about in the future. Poop contains nutrients, and a large concentration of that poop is not really going to be something that is easy for decomposers to break down and cycle back. So a lot of that ends up running off and then ends up in the water and causes excess nutrient concentrations, which can lead to something called eutrophication that we're going to talk about later. But I want to introduce you to the term so when you see it in the future, you can be like, oh, that's what Mystery was talking about. And then finally, when we burn fossil fuels, that can actually release a couple of chemicals that contain nitrogen into the atmosphere. So there's nitrous oxide, which is actually a greenhouse gas, and then what we call nitrogen oxides, the formula for which is NOx. And notice that instead of having a number here, we have X because you have a bunch of different types of nitrogen oxides. You can have NO, NO2, NO3. So it's just N with any number of O's associated with it. And those things can cause specific types of pollution that we'll learn about later. So that's it for nitrogen cycle. Pretty short set of notes, and we'll get phosphorus up any minute now. Well, sometime today.